Hello, 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 my friends. Thank you for joining me, and welcome to this panel of WriteHiveCon 2025. This is In Defense of Disney, Fairy Tales and Retellings. I'm Nicholas W. Fuller. I'm a booktuber and an author, and I just released, where is it? There it is, Shattered. But I'm here to introduce the lovely Rae D'Arc, who is presenting on this topic. Rae D'Arc has been involved in every stage of a book's life. As a writer, editor, retailer, reader, and reviewer, she once worked 4 part-time jobs simultaneously. Thankfully, one of them actually paid her. She received her bachelor's in English from Brigham Young University and now lives in the Tri-Cities of Washington with her husband and an Aussie dog. Very nice. Who doesn't love a lovely dog, right? Rae, thank you for joining us, and I'm excited to hear your presentation on fairy tales and retellings.
Yep, thank you so much for having me. I love being a part of Bright Hive and just the community that it provides. So welcome. Yes, this is In Defense of Disney, fairy tales and retellings. I'll be in the chat to answer any of your questions along the way, but also feel free to take pictures of the slides because we're going to blitz through this. My quick qualifications for this presentation include my bachelor's in English from Brigham Young University, where I studied and focused on folklore and historical literature of England. In Defense of Disney was the title of my 25-page essay for my capstone class on Western European fairy tales. But this simplified and story-filled presentation will explore the origin stories of fairy tales, Princess and the Frog, and Sleeping Beauty through folklore to demonstrate the transformations they've taken in modern retellings. After graduating, I've continued to study fairy tales to create my own retellings. This started in my second haunted romance book, Don't Marry the Cursed, with influences from the juniper tree, the Fitcher's bird, the robber bridegroom, and the yellow dwarf from the Grimm's brothers. In my research, I laughed at how many fairy tale female protagonists are put to sleep, leading me to wonder, what are they all dreaming about? And that inspired my Dreaming Princesses series, retellings of Sleeping Beauty, Snowdrop, A Popular Tale, The Princess and the Peas, Little Red Riding Hood, The Miller's Daughter, and The Story of the Three Bears. There's a lot in there. So let's get into it, though. Imagine a day of running around Hollywood studios of Disney World in Orlando, Florida. You've been there since rope drop, snacking on overpriced and delicious treats, running across the park because Star Wars Rise of the Resistance opened late. You're trying to hit all the best rides, shows, and forms of entertainment. It's hot and humid, and you feel a little queasy after Tower of Terror, so you say, let's sit down for a quick show. Hey, look, there's Beauty and the Beast live on stage. What book lover doesn't love Belle and her adventure in a magical castle with a giant library? You sit near the middle, and they urge you to scoot close to your neighbor to fit more people on the stands. You slide next to a lone man who's maybe in his late 60s. He asks, do you know what this is about? Yeah, it's Beauty and the Beast. Um, what is that? I know, right? This is actually a true story from my own experience, as I had a hard time answering this man's question because it took me a good moment to realize he was serious. I thought, how does an average American man reach their 60s without knowing the story of Beauty and the Beast? As it turned out, he had been too busy working all his life, but now, as a grandfather, he wanted to connect with his grandchildren by learning about their interests. And that's what folklore and fairy tales do. As stories specifically meant to be shared and told to teach children, fairy tales are passed down through generations and serve as a way to connect us with our heritage. But as they are passed down, they change and grow with time. Let me explain. Once upon a time, I was ignorant enough to think that the movies came first. Sorry, but no, Disney didn't create the original versions of their famous fairy tale princess stories. Please debunk any beliefs that Disney was the first, or the Brothers Grimm, or Charles Perrault, or any specific writer, because writers didn't create the originals. fairy tales. Every fairy tale we know was originally created by storytellers. Now, how many of you have ever played the game of telephone? Then you know how words change every time the story is told, and with each person who shares the story. The tales grew and developed until some folklorists decided to collect the tales, write them down, then distribute them through print. So, as I talk about the origins of fairy tales, I'm not going to use the term original because the original versions, as they were first told by their first storytellers, are lost and probably weren't all that good because I don't know anyone who's told a story perfectly without revisions. So, fairy tales come from folklore. Folklore is an umbrella term for wisdom and art of the folk. Folklore includes stories, traditions, dances, for, basically anything that creates a culture, such as popular stories and fairy tales. While folklore can be based on experiences both true and fictional, fairy tales are strictly fictional, but they have real morals based on reality while creating their own reality. Because of this, we can study them for historical context. The main characters are usually children before marrying age, which before the 1700s, that simply meant prepubescence because you were a child, then you went through puberty and became an adult, able to have kids and work for your living. So, literary and folklore scholar Jack Sipes, however, he says fairy tales were intended to explain natural occurrences such as changes of the season and shifts in the weather, or to celebrate rites like marriage and hunting. However, if you read the rest of his article or his full article, you'll learn that he really doesn't like what Disney has done to the fairy tales. There are many fairy tale critics and young readers who bash on Disney because the studio changed the story. But in case you missed the title of this presentation, I will speak in defense of Disney. With the help of my university textbooks, let me take you back to the origins of fairy tales. It would be impossible to go through the origins of every fairy tale in an hour, so I'd like to focus on two fairy tales retold by Disney: Princess and the Frog, which is an obvious deviation from the classic, as they start the movie with the tale, then switch it up by turning the woman into a frog also. Then Sleeping Beauty, which most people assume follows the classic fairy tale. So let's start with the obvious deviant, The Princess and the Frog. Despite the German brothers making it famous, the story is largely from the United Kingdom. Its concept appears to originate in Scotland from a list of stories that shepherds told each other back in 1549 AD. Compared to others like Cinderella, with roots back to 23 AD near Rome and has Asian counterparts with a goldfish godmother, this makes it a fairly new fairy tale. They make interesting comparisons though, because the Frog Prince actually has like a gender swapped Cinderella theme. I've discovered that most Americans only know the following snippet of the tale that's quoted in the Disney film. A princess kisses the frog and he turns into a prince. Then they live happily ever after. With that as public knowledge, it's not surprising that the creators at Disney Studios turned the story into a lengthy adventure across the swamp with Mardi Gras and voodoo, because why not? Perhaps this is because the tale has such a wide scope of variations, despite being one of the newer fairy tales. If you know any more than the Disney version of Princess and the Frog, it's probably because you've read the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. However, my Grimm's collection includes two different versions of this tale. I asked someone who speaks German and thoroughly studied the Grimm's tales to learn that both versions are accurate, simply published at different times and coming from different sources. Because again, this is folklore. Not every person telling it will tell it the same way. They both begin the same. The young princess would play with a golden ball, her favorite toy, near a spring of water. One time, while playing, her ball fell into the water and became lost. She cried aloud until a frog came and asked her what was wrong. Lamenting the loss of her ball, the frog said he would retrieve it if she promised to let him live with her, eat from her plate, and sleep in her bed. Thinking that a crazy talking frog couldn't actually retrieve her ball, the princess agreed. Straight away, he retrieved her ball. She took it, then ran home before the frog could follow her. That night, while eating supper, there was a knock on the door. It was the frog, speaking in rhyme about letting him in and keeping her promise. Her father, the king, demanded that she keep her promise. So she let the frog in. They ate from the same plate, then prepared to sleep in the same bed. The princess complained, but her father insisted. At this point, though, the two stories in my collection divert. The more popular version continues. The young princess slept with the frog in her bed. When waking, he was gone, and she was relieved to think she'd never see him again. She was wrong. He returned the next night for the same request to eat from her plate and sleep in her bed. When waking after the third night of sharing her plate with the frog and plate and frog with the bed, plate and bed with the frog, she found no frog, but a handsome prince standing at the head of her bed. He explained that a malicious fairy had cursed him to be a frog until a princess would let him sleep with her for 3 nights. Now, freed from his curse, he asked the princess to marry him and join him in his kingdom, where he was reunited with his faithful servant, Henry, and they lived happily ever after. The end. Yeah. I'm guessing the moral of this story is supposed to be about keeping your promises, but honestly, I get caught up by the fact that she lets a strange frog slash man sleep with her for 3 days and then is rewarded for doing so. The other version in my collection, however, instead is summarized as follows. So after that first night of sharing her meal with the frog, rather than let the disgusting frog sleep in her bed for even one night, the young princess became really cross, picked him up, and threw him with all her might against the wall, saying, "Now you'll get your rest, you disgusting frog." When the frog landed, he became a beautiful prince. He explained how a witch had cursed him to be a frog and only she could release him from the spring. The king bid them to marry, and they set out to the prince's kingdom with a carriage driven by his faithful servant, Heinrich, not Henry. Heinrich had been so saddened by the prince's curse that he had his heart encased by 3 golden hoops to keep it from breaking. While driving, the prince heard breaking noises and asked Heinrich if the carriage was breaking. This happened 3 times as Heinrich replied that it was the hoops breaking around his heart because he was so happy that the prince was healed. The end. First of all, what's with the random romance at the end? I mean, I really want to know what else is with that. And please note, neither of these versions included kisses. The princess either slept with him or tried to kill him. And what's funny is this isn't the only deadly version. If you really want to dive into fairy tales and folklore, Auntie Arn made an index of themes from the Grimm's fairy tales. It was later expanded with fairy tales and folklore across the world by Stith Thompson and Hans Georg Uther to make it a tool for folklorists to categorize stories. The Grimm's Brothers' Frog Prince was categorized as a type 440 tale, meaning it has this list of themes. Feel free to take a picture of this slide because I don't have time to read them all out loud. But these themes are how we have stories like the Frog Prince, the Frog King, Prince Paddock, the Popular Tale, and the Tale of the Well at the World's End. These classifications give us variants in Jewish culture, India, China, Chile, and Africa. So going back to its origins, though, in Scotland, in 1549, Mary, the Queen of Scots, had married the English King Edward VI. So England was trying to unite their kingdoms. Typical of Scotland, they wanted nothing to do with that and published an anti-England booklet called The Complaint of Scotland. Among the political essays, the booklet included some Scottish folklore of the ballads and Scottish folklore of ballads and a list of stories collected from local shepherds and seamen, aka the folk. One of the shepherds' stories included was the tale of the Well of the World's End. However, This version of the tale wasn't written down until 1842 by Robert Chambers, who set down as much of it as he could after hearing it from Charles Kirkpatrick Sharp, who heard it from his nurse around 1784, 58 years earlier. You see how fairy tales are a game of telephone? The story basically goes as follows. A lady is sent by her stepmother to draw water from the well of the world's end. After encountering many dangers, she reaches a well and finds a frog. He says that first she must become his betrothed or become torn to pieces. The lady agrees to marriage, draws the water, then returns home. At midnight, the frog appears outside and demands entrance, calling on her promise. He asks to be given supper, put to bed, and then asks for an axe to chop off his head. The young lassie does so, and the paddo becomes the bonniest young prince that ever was seen. Okay, don't ask me how a beheading turns a frog into a prince, but how many of you expected that? According to Arne Thompson's index, this version is also classified as a Type 440 tale, but as you can tell, it doesn't meet all of the same classifications. In the 1790s, the popular tale uses the same basic setup of the tale of the well at the world's end. But instead of asking for an axe, the frog asks to come in, jumps up on the princess's knee, and then is restored to human form. And then going back just a decade earlier, Prince Paddock is very similar to the tale of the well of the world's end, except she doesn't have a regular bucket. She has to use a sieve. So, yeah, one of those cooking things with holes in them. A frog at the well said he could tell her how to do it, but only for her promise of marriage. Here's a Goodreads list of modern retellings of The Frog Prince if you want more ideas. And considering all that Disney creators could have done with this story versus what they did, I'm inclined to say that they were more focused on creating an African American princess than retelling the classic versions of the story. But that's what we do as writers, and with fairy tales. We take our favorite parts, then spin them according to our audiences. So, if I still haven't convinced you, let's move on to Sleeping Beauty. This was Disney's second full-length film after Snow White, which is fairly close to the Grimm's version, including the hired huntsman to bring back her heart, but minus the magical corset and poisoned comb attempts to kill her. For their second full-length film, you'd think they'd stay pretty close to the Grimm's tale again. And they did, for the most part, but they also took inspiration from a surprising source, and Grimm's only told half of the story. To explain, let's go back to the origins of one of our oldest fairy tales. Let's start with some Norse mythology. Within the Volsunga saga, we have a story of Sigurd and Brynhild, who was banished to Earth and forced to wed. Brynhild's biggest fear was to marry a coward, so, wearing full armor, Odin touched her with a thorn of sleep to preserve her, then put her in a deserted castle surrounded by flames. When a man, Sigurd, removed her armor, he would instantly fall in love with her and she would wake. Sound familiar? Please note, there was no kiss. But did you notice the similarities? In fact, Sleeping Beauty is classified by Arne Thompson Uther as a Type 410 tale with any and or all of the following points. Again, feel free to snap a picture because we don't have time to go over them individually. While it might seem like a bit of a stretch, I prefer that version over this next one that meets a lot more of the classifications, and has an intriguing link between the legends of Alexander the Great and King Arthur. So one of the oldest versions of Sleeping Beauty is in Persepolis, as deities Venus, Lucina, and Themis were invited to a banquet to honor the birth of the king's daughter, Zalandine. Themis was offended by a missing knife at her table setting and put an unknown curse on the babe. After growing up a bit, Zalandine fell asleep while spinning flax. Years later, Prince Troilus finds her and, well, she wakes up pregnant. Yeah, how many of you knew that version? But look at how many more points it means. Unfortunately, it's not alone, but I'm going to skip ahead in time to a synopsis of the Grimm's tale since this is the written version most commonly known. So, a barren queen saved a fish by putting it into the river. In return, the fish foretold the birth of her daughter. At her birth, the king held a feast, inviting 12 of the 13 fairies because they only had 12 gold plates. They each blessed the babe, but after 11 had blessed her, the 13th arrived. She scolded the king for not inviting her, then cursed the babe to be killed by a spindle on her 15th year. Then the 12th fairy blessed the babe to only fall asleep for 100 years. The king ordered all spindles burnt, but on her 15th birthday, the king and queen were gone, and she found an old woman spinning. The princess wanted to try, but the spindle wounded her and she fell. The whole court was also put to sleep. Then a large hedge of thorns grew around the palace until only rumors remained of Briar Rose sleeping inside. 100 years later, a king's son heard about the castle with the princess inside. The prince came to the thicket, and he saw nothing but beautiful flowers surrounding the castle. He went through easily, but the door shut behind him. He found Briar Rose, gave her a kiss, and she woke and smiled. They went out to the court where everyone else woke, and they were married and lived happily ever after. Yay! As you may tell, this was the base tale for Arne Thompson's Type 410. However, would you believe that this was one of the first times Sleeping Beauty woke with a kiss? The kiss awakening became popular as the story was told in pantomimes in the 1840s, but not much before then. But did you notice all the similarities with Disney's version? I'm not saying it's bad. I understand why the creators at Disney added humor with the fairies, romance between Aurora and the prince before the spindle, and suspense with the dragon, because seriously, dragons make all stories cooler, right? But let's look at another version that Disney took inspiration from. In 1636, we get Basile's Pantamaron, and day 5, tale 5, goes as follows. A king assembled wise men to foretell the future of his newborn daughter, Talia. They conferred together that peril would find her from a splinter in some flax. The king ordered no flax or similar material to enter his palace. But Talia, grown up, saw an old woman spinning and asked to try. She drew out the thread, got a splinter, then fell dead. The king placed her on a velvet chair, locked the palace, and abandoned her. Unknown time passed, and a new king came by while hunting. The king went inside, found Talia, and did some things without her conscious consent, then left. Talia had twins, a boy and a girl named Sun and Moon. Translation, Jor and Aurora. Yeah, who were looked after by fairies until one babe sucked on her finger, sucking the splinter out and waking Talia. Soon after, the king returned and they bonded several days. Except the king was married! Yeah, yeah. And his wife guessed his adultery. By a trick, the wife obtained the twins and told the cook to make them into hash. Instead, the cook killed 2 kid goats to serve to the king, while the queen said, "You are eating what is your own." Believing that he ate his children, the king left on a new hunting crusade. With the king gone, Talia was ordered to be burnt alive. But she played for time, suggesting she first undressed because her clothes were beautiful. She was stripped down to her unclothed clothes before the king arrived and saved them. Yeah. I hope I wasn't the only one surprised by the small but obvious similarities to Disney's animated version. Yep, Princess Aurora was named after Talia's daughter, who was raised by fairies. But this next version is my favorite, and the one that I used for inspiring my own fairy tale retelling, Dreaming Beauty. Here is Charles Perrault's La Belle au Bois du Monde. Sorry, I don't speak French, but it's translated simply as Sleeping Beauty. A daughter was born to an old king and queen. to celebrate the invited 7 fairies. But an old fairy came without an invite. They thought she was dead. They set the table for her, but didn't have a gold plate. A good fairy heard the old one muttering threats, so she hid herself to be the last one to bless the babe. The others blessed her, but then the vengeful fairy cursed her to die from a spindle. The last fairy came to say that after 100 years, a king's son would wake her. The king banned all spinning with a distaff and spindle. But 15 or 16 years later, the princess was alone in the castle, met a woman with a spindle, and the princess tried to spin, but pricked herself and fell. The king lay her in finery without aging. The good fairy returned to the castle and put everyone in the palace to sleep too. As time passed, trees, bushes, and brambles grew so nothing could pass through. A king's son was hunting and saw the tops of the castle towers and believed himself to be the one to wake the legendary sleeping princess. The wood made way for him to pass through, but the trees closed around him, allowing none others to pass. The prince found her laying on the bed. He approached and fell before her on his knees. She woke, saying, "Is it you, my prince? You have waited a great while." He confessed his love and loyalty. Then they talked for hours, weeping more than speaking. The castle woke, music played, and they were married. But it's not happily ever after yet. That's only the first half of the story. Notice there was no kiss, but also no sexual abuse. Remember, this version is from 1697, and the kiss wasn't popularized until the 1800s. The prince returned to his kingdom the next day with the excuse that he got lost. The king believed the lie, but the ogress stepmother did not, when the prince went hunting every day with some excuse. After 2 years and 2 children, morning and day, notice they're different but similar to Pantaleone's version, the king died and the prince became the king, declaring his marriage publicly and welcoming the princess with their 2 children. The young king left for war, but as soon as he was gone, the ogress mother-in-law sent the princess and children to a country home in the woods. After a few days, she asked the chef to cook morning for her dinner. Instead, he killed a lamb and sent morning to his wife in his lodging on the other side of the courtyard. 8 days later, the ogress asked to eat day, and the chef sent him away also. Then she wanted to eat the princess, who was 20 years old by now. The chef explained that her children were alive and sent the princess to his lodgings too. He fed the ogress a young horse, as she planned to tell the young king that wolves had eaten his wife and children. But one day, the ogress heard a child crying. She demanded a large tub of serpents for the princess and children, chef and his wife. They were about to be thrown into the tub when the king arrived. Yay. Unwilling to confess, though, the ogress dived into the tub and was devoured. Look at how many points that covers. But that all of that was the first half of the story, which may help explain why Disney creators cut most of it. Also, dragons are cooler than ogres. Along those lines, though, consider how much the world changed between the late 1600s and the late 1950s. We now had a life stage called a teenager, and film wasn't simply on the rise, it was in color. And same with every movie adaptation, some things simply don't convert well between books and film. So yes, Disney altered the fairy tales according to his audience's preferences, then distributed them in a method most accessible for his audience. You know who also did that? Shakespeare. All of his historical plays take a lot of liberties. You know someone else who did that, though? Charles Perrault, and every modern writer of fairy tale retellings, including myself. Because fairy tales originate from storytellers, they grow with time and change between audiences. The very act of changing a fairy tale to better suit your audience is a natural part of the fairy tale journey. I will die on this hill. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Whoops, sorry. I'm skipping ahead. With that said, though, I want to encourage you with your fairy tale retellings. Do not reference Disney or anything published from the last 70 years, but because they will hunt you down with lawsuits, but play with the plethora of public domain fairy tales. This is part of the fun of fairy tale retellings. We're basically writing fan fiction, but we can get away with it because it's public domain. Considering the various forms of fan fiction, all of these have been done with fairy tales. I found this list of fan fiction variations off of Tumblr, and I'm sure there are more types, but let's just look at Cinderella and its many film adaptations. We have a lot of different options. I know there are tons more, and maybe you'll disagree with me on some of these labels, but my point is fairy tales give us basic plots and some key characters to play with and reimagine. They create a sense of familiarity with the reader who knows the classic concepts, but then we get to spin and reinvent them in refreshing ways that make readers think. So, go ahead and pull a Disney. Read an old fairy tale and make it uniquely yours. And that's all from me. You can contact me or learn more about my books on my website or Facebook or Instagram, and I'll be in the chat for questions until the hour's up. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time at Write Hive, and thank you all for coming.